Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Realms of Chaos for DOS. This is an action platformer developed by Apogee and released in 1995 for DOS, and it's a fairly interesting game, mostly because of the switch mechanic that it operates on. But it was decently well received for its day, particularly for a DOS platformer, and it's gained a pretty decent sized following over the years. Now, something interesting to note is that this actually underwent development originally as the sequel to Paganitsu, which was a puzzle game that Apogee had released back in 1991, and it wasn't anything particularly special, frankly, but I will be covering that in a later video, of course. The thing is that even though this started development as a sequel to Paganitsu, it really doesn't have anything to do with it at all, and the only real ties to it are that it started out as that development and that the developers are the people who originally worked on Paganitsu back in the day. So now that we know what it's not, let's go ahead and delve into it and find out exactly what it is and how it holds up. Well, as far as presentation goes, it is a 2D platformer and it runs entirely on pixel art, which is to be expected for a 1995 release, but they've actually done a pretty good job of making everything surprisingly detailed when you actually get into the meat of the game. The environments have a pretty decent amount of detail in them, and some of them have some fairly nice touches like, say, reflective surfaces and such like that. But it's not just the environments that look pretty good. In fact, they've done a rather good job with the character animations as well, which are surprisingly smooth and fluid. They flow together really well, and it ends up looking very nice as a result. Well, for the most part anyway. There are a few here and there that are a bit messy, but for the most part they've done a very good job with it, at least. Luckily, there is a pretty good amount of variety in the levels and the characters as far as their visual design goes, so it doesn't really wear on you at any given point. Then you move over into sound design, you find that this thing took advantage of the sound technology of the day, which was basically Sound Blaster, and you end up with a lot of fairly decent digitized sound effects, with some pretty meaty gore sounds when you hit certain enemies, which is always pretty pleasant. Obviously, they're not very impressive to modern ears because they are fairly low-quality digitized sound effects, but they've done a pretty good job with them nonetheless, given the age of the game. Then, of course, there's the soundtrack, which is a pretty decent fantasy soundtrack that's going for a bit of a darker tone and trying to set more of a moody atmosphere, and it mostly does the job pretty well, although there are a few tracks here and there that are a bit more upbeat. The problem is that none of it is remotely memorable. It's only things that work in the moment, and you're not going to sit there and go, oh, hey, Realms of Chaos, I really want to listen to that soundtrack outside of the course of the game, which is, of course, a bit of a letdown, but it's certainly not anything that's going to be remotely a deal breaker. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although the story is extremely minimal throughout the game, so what you're going to end up falling back on is almost exclusively the gameplay. Still, the story itself is that you play as Endrick the warrior and Alondra the sorceress, who are siblings, and they are going off to find what is going on with the land of Mysteria and to right the wrongs that are causing all kinds of corruption across it. There's really no nuance to it, it's just a basic hero story, and it works okay for the context of the game, but it does mean that you're not really dealing with much writing along the way. Thus, you mostly end up turning to the gameplay to bring things up, and that's where things get a bit more interesting, because you have that switch mechanic, where you can switch between Alondra and Endrick whenever you want by pressing the spacebar, and then you get two different health bars between them, as well as two different sets of abilities. Endrick is slower and doesn't jump as high, but he has a sword that does more damage than Alondra's magical attacks, and it doesn't require any ammo, so that's always nice. Whereas Alondra is faster and able to jump farther, which means that if you come to a particularly large jump, you're going to want to rely on Alondra, and she also gets magical attacks, which are projectiles, but they use ammunition in the form of gems, and eventually you can upgrade that to the point where it will be a bit better than Endrick's sword attack, but until you get to that point, it is a fairly wimpy attack. Now, the idea is that you're going to switch back and forth between them to tackle the situation at hand. Got a particularly long jump? Switch over to Alondra. Got an enemy that needs to be smacked upside the head repeatedly until it explodes in a shower of blood? Well, get Endrick out there. And it's not just to fit the situation at hand, there's also the strategic element of waiting until you can get health items, because you can't regenerate your health automatically or anything of that nature. Instead, you have to find health pickups in the form of potions scattered throughout the levels, and that are occasionally dropped by enemies. Now, each of these two characters has their own health bar. Alondra has less health than Endrick does in the long run, but they do have different health bars, meaning that if one of them is particularly injured, then you can switch over to the other character and play as them for a while with more health until you eventually find a healing item that you can use on the other character. This is a cool idea, and it actually works out pretty well for the game in the long run. In fact, most of the mechanics work out pretty well for the game in the long run. The controls are pretty tight and responsive, meaning that you never feel like you don't have enough control over your character, and there's plenty of opportunity for figuring out exactly where you need to go and exactly how you need to jump in a given situation in order to get through the levels safely and without too much damage done to you. The problems start to come in more in the level design side of things because, for the most part, this is a pretty standard 90s platformer as far as its level design goes. Lots of instant death pits, including, of course, spike pits, as well as water, because apparently neither of your characters can swim, meaning that you really do have to take care not to fall into one of those pits by accident or on purpose, so to speak, where you'll hop into an enemy or an enemy will come up and hit you and then you get sent reeling back suddenly into an instant death pit. And when the screen starts scrolling, you'll want to make sure that you aren't in the wrong position at that particular point. Don't go too far ahead, because things like a boulder can fall and instantly kill you, which is incredibly irritating. And occasionally you'll even have to worry about respawning enemies. Usually they're very easy to beat, it's just that they just keep spawning over and over and over again until you get through that particular bit of the area. So it's definitely an old school platformer at heart. There's a lot of patience required, and you really do need to learn the levels as you go along, because about the only thing the game does to help you out is occasionally give you some power-ups. Now these can be things like invincibility power-ups, as well as a power-up that will just instantly kill everything that's on the screen except for you, of course, or a power-up that will increase your weapon's potential, meaning that in Indrik's case, basically makes the slash a wider radius, and in Alondra's case, it's a more powerful fireball spell. The thing is that all of these power-ups cost gems, and gems are also your ammunition for the spells, so you really do need to weigh the cost and the benefit of what it is that you're running into along the way. And then there's the boss fights, where you're fighting a particularly large enemy that has a particular way of beating it efficiently, and thus you end up messing around with that until you figure out what the gimmick is, and then you go through and you beat the enemy in whatever fashion is best to beat them in. And when you put all this together, despite the occasional issues that the game presents, for the most part it's a very well put together platformer. Really, most of the issues with it are a result of the old school design philosophy, where there's so many of those screw you moments where you just have to memorize the levels, and that's definitely a product of its time. Nearly all platformers were like that back then, and that means that for a modern gamer it can be a bit more difficult to be able to get into something like this. But for people who are into those old school platformers, you'll probably be able to get a fair bit out of Realms of Chaos. Just be warned that if you're playing this on anything lower than the normal difficulty, it's going to be kind of a cakewalk, and anything from the normal difficulty or higher is pretty much just going to kick your ass. The normal difficulty is pretty manageable, so I would recommend trying it on that first if you're going to give it a shot. But if you play the hardest difficulty, then the screen is constantly scrolling no matter whether that level was designed to do that or not, and it can get incredibly frustrating simply because that difficulty level is simply unfair. Hell, even the challenge mode, which is just the hard difficulty in the game, is a bit unfair at times, just because it will whoop your ass left, right, and center, and you'll just be like, well, how do I even manage this? But if you go into it knowing that it's going to whoop your ass, knowing that it is definitely an old school platformer and it's certainly not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, then you might be able to get some enjoyment out of the game. But for everyone else, it's a bit harder to recommend. The only people I can definitely recommend it to are DOS enthusiasts or platform enthusiasts, because they'll be able to get the most out of it. But it is harder to recommend to a more general audience simply because most people out there are not going to be able to deal with these old school platformers and the level of difficulty that they throw at you. And if you turn down the difficulty to the easy or super easy mode, then you're just not really going to get much out of the game to begin with. So in that case, if you want to pick it up, then I could say wait for it to go on sale, because even though it is really cheap to begin with right now, and I will have a link in the video description box where you can pick it up if you're interested, if it's on sale for just a couple bucks, then you're not really going to feel like there's any real loss there if you end up not really liking it all that much. But for DOS enthusiasts, and DOS platformer enthusiasts especially, definitely pick it up because it's one of the better examples of DOS platforming out there. Thanks for watching.